Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads, and I will be the heard but not seen moderator for a very interesting discussion we have for you today. So join us today are two people who you may know from the comment section of Blogging Heads. Uh, so I will ask them to introduce themselves. So first, David, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is David Howard, actually known on Blogging Heads as Wanderment, that which originally evolved from wonderment, and over the years has kind of morphed. I am an educator and a translator and a peace activist, and that's my intro.
And our other guest today is Dan Kaufman. Dan, can you introduce yourself?
So I'm Daniel Kaufman. For a long time, I was commenting under the name Aravis Tarkina. I'm migrating away from it just because it's starting to get confusing balancing these different names. I have done some Blogging Heads shows with Massimo Pigliucci as well as with Aryeh. And by profession, I am a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University.
Great. So thank you so much to both of you for coming on today. So you two have had a kind of a running debate going in various comments, below various videos on Blogging Heads about the Israel-Palestine question, and so I thought it would be interesting to get you together on camera and see kind of where everyone is coming from and where the core disagreements lie, and whether there's some kind of common ground that we can find between both of you. So I thought we would start with kind of talking about how you end up in your current position in this debate. So, David, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So first, I'd like to thank you both for inviting me to do this Blogging Heads. I did a couple in the past with Bob, not on this topic, however. Um, Yeah, so I think what we kind of agreed to do is to look at our backgrounds, both as Jews, and how our backgrounds influenced where we are today. So I will start out by saying that I am a year older than the state of Israel. I was born in 1947, and so I think that informs my view in the fact that um, my life has kind of been infused with that intersection of Zionism and Judaism. Although I do remember a time before I was Jewish when I was just sort of a human being and a mensch, as we say, a child of God, and had not, I was free of those kinds of religious and ethnic entanglements. So I like to look at that kind of period too as a child before I kind of got all these accretions, I might call it. Anyway, so my family is Ashkenazi, back many generations, and all four of my grandparents were Yiddish-speaking immigrants from Eastern Europe, mostly what's now Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, and so another influence on me, I think, was knowing why they came to America and eventually to Mexico as well. And one of I think there were two big factors in the family's origins coming here. The first one was to kind of escape the goyim from the oppressors in Eastern Europe. Um, I certainly don't mean that as an offensive slur, but that's the way I was raised, thinking of that oppressive class. But also they were fleeing orthodoxy, which became very clear to me uh, at a young age. I would hear stories about um, freedom in America, um, meaning the freedom to not be orthodox and to not have the kind of submission to the East European clergy. So I grew up in a secular environment, but by kind of a weird quirk of fate, uh, when my father died when I was very young, when I was 7 years old, and my mother had a big argument with the local rabbi, And so and I was sort of a unruly child, so she sent me to an Orthodox religious school, not a day school, but for Hebrew school. And um, there I met, I think it was kind of the secular version of sending your kid to military school. So, I learned to live very much in an Orthodox environment. I had Orthodox Jewish education. And my rabbi was a really great man named Yehezkel Lindenthal, who was one of those guys who had the Torah, literally memorized. You could say Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12, and he would tell you what was there, word for word. So he was a great scholar. He was also a mole and a circumciser and a ritual slaughterer of animals. So he was a real old school rabbi. And he had gone to Palestine just before, I lost the video there for a second. He had gone to Palestine just during the early years of the Holocaust, and married a Palestinian woman, Jewish woman, who was a Sabra. She was born there, and they came to the United States. So when I met my rabbi, he had his whole family had been murdered, and all his siblings, his parents, his grandparents, all had been murdered by the Nazis. So that was a really big influence on my life as well. I also lived in a very Jewish neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut. There were many synagogues. You would see a lot of survivors from the war, refugees. So, my rabbi was a really hardcore kind of Zionist, but he was a wonderful, peaceful, loving man who had a very long career as a synagogue rabbi. Being a real great role model for everyone in the community, and a model for me of service much later on in my life. Anyway, so fast forward, I became an activist during the Vietnam War, peace activist, and eventually, I'll fast forward a little bit more. My beliefs really evolved into pacifism. I am a pacifist today. I belong to pacifist organizations, including the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which has a Jewish group called Jewish Fellowship of Peace. And that's an interfaith organization as well. That was kind of my whole adult life, was working in those terms with peace and resisting the draft during the Vietnam War. And during the Iraq War, I was I did a lot of counter recruitment and the Afghanistan War, counter recruitment activities on high school campuses. We would go in and talk to kids about alternatives to the military. So I think that kind of gives you an idea of my political background. I also, another big influence that I want to get to here is that I think the biggest influence on my beliefs on what can happen in the Middle East, my hopefulness about the Middle East, is that I live in a bicultural, bilingual family, and in a bicultural community. So, we speak Spanish at home. We speak Spanish at work all the time, going back and forth from English to Spanish. My kids were raised in two religions. My wife is a practicing Roman Catholic. So that kind of background for me is something that gives me a lot of faith in the ability of peoples like Jews and Muslims, Palestinians and Israelis to really come together and reject violence and work together for peace.
And would you say that, was there one moment in your life where you turned against Zionism, or was there like kind of a gradual moving away from your previous beliefs?
Yeah, well, I think there were a couple of interesting moments I had. Let me see. I remember one time I lived in Mexico City for 12 years, and I remember having lunch with a British philosophy professor, actually. And, this was a time when, in the conversation, we were having a conversation about nationalism. And, he was very anti-war and very critical of the United States' role back in the Vietnam days. And he said, why would anybody die for their country? And at the time I said, well, I think I wouldn't die for the United States, but I might die for Israel. And he just looked at me in kind of awe and said, I really feel sorry for you. And I don't know, that was kind of a real awakening moment for me, because it really caused me to re-examine those beliefs. And I did find, something fundamentally wrong about being willing to fight for a cause, an ideology, even an ideology that seemed so justified to me at the time because of the Holocaust, basically. And so there was that kind of reflection that I did, and also became disenchanted over the years with Israeli policy. Very definitely, that happened to me in the course of the years. And then lately, since about the year 2000, great disillusionment in the possibility of a two-state solution. So okay, go ahead. Yeah, maybe I talked a little too long on that.
Well, yeah, why don't we move to Dan? So, Dan, do you want to talk about how your beliefs on this subject have evolved?
Sure. Well, mine really haven't evolved very much. In other words, I didn't go through a kind of change the way that David did. My views on this have pretty much stayed the same. My mother was born in Hungary, actually in Transylvania, in a part of Hungary that's now Romania, a city called Cluj. Hungarian, it's Kolozsvár. My father was born in Mannheim, Germany in 1928. And my father's family fled Germany in 1933. So this was when Jews could still leave. This was before the final solution. This was before, this was when Jews were still allowed to leave the country, although they weren't allowed to take anything with them, or very little with them. And my father's family, my father's grandfather basically split the family in half, sent half the family to the United States and half the family to Palestine. And my father was in the half that went to Palestine. My father thus grew up, from the age of 5 years old, grew up in what was then Palestine and was to become Israel. And as a teenager, joined the underground, and specifically the Haganah, which at the time, what my father spent most of his time doing in the Haganah was smuggling Jewish refugees off of boats into Palestine, refugees from the concentration camps off of boats into Palestine, because the British were enforcing a very strict quota. They only permitted a certain number of Jews to come in, and the rest would be turned back. And so a lot of what my father was doing was smuggling Holocaust survivors off of boats into Palestine, as well as fighting the British, trying to get the British to leave.
So this is the era in between 1945 and 1948.
That's right. And so once the War of Independence started, basically all the Jewish irregulars were turned into the First Israeli Army. So my father went from being in the Haganah to being in the First Israeli Army. So my father is literally one of the founding fathers of the State of Israel. And so obviously, if your family was part of the founding generation of the United States, as some people are, that causes very deep feelings of self-identification. Not to mention the fact that that so much of the reasons for the founding were wrapped up with what my father was spending so much time doing, and that is getting Jewish refugees from concentration camps out of boats after the Europeans had tried to murder them all. My mother, who's a bit younger than my father, came to Israel a different way. She actually was in a concentration camp. Her family was sent to Bergen-Belsen. Her father was killed by the Hungarian Arrow Cross, which was the sort of the local fascist organizations. That there was a version of this in virtually every country in Eastern Europe. And so my mother, her mother, and her sister wound up in Bergen-Belsen, and sort of survived till the end. And then afterwards, they came to what was already Israel as refugees. My father and my mother met then in Israel. And that's where they dated, they courted. They only came to the United States in the 1950s. So, back in the 19th century, Theodor Herzl, the raison d'etre for Zionism, as Theodor Herzl said in the 19th century, was that he saw it as the only solution to what was called the Jewish question, and that is how what's supposed to happen to Jews, because Jews could not live in Europe. For millennia, Jews had suffered virulent Christian anti-Semitism across Europe. They were largely not able to really integrate into European societies, to the extent to which they were able to assimilate during the Haskalah in some of the more enlightened European countries. It was later revealed that assimilation was very thin, and was and that the Gentiles, the Gentile population, their acceptance of that assimilation was very thin. And so the reason for Zionism to begin with is precisely because it was believed by that point that the Jews, if they didn't have their own nation, were not going to survive as a people. And Herzl's speculation became no longer a speculation in the 20th century. It became a very, very real reality. And so if you ask me today, what's the main reason for why I am a Zionist and why I support the state of Israel, is because I agree with Herzl, and I have zero confidence that at this point in the state of the world, the Jews are safe without their own national homeland, and I would have to see several centuries worth of something different to counteract the last 2 millennia worth before I would change my view on that. I mean, and this is the sort of thing, where maybe David and I are going to differ a lot. I'm not an idealist, and I'm not willing to take chances on ideals when the consequences are utter devastation. And so, to my mind, the state of Israel is the reason why my family's alive. And that's why I'm so committed to it. That said, the tradition of Zionism I come from is from the left. It's easy to forget now because the right has dominated Israeli politics now for a few decades, but the Israeli right had almost no the right in Israel had almost no political clout until Begin. Until Begin became prime minister. It was a left-wing country. It was founded largely by socialists, and so I belong to a left-wing Zionist tradition, not a right-wing Zionist tradition. I'll just say one other thing, since David spoke a lot about his Jewishness. My father's father was Orthodox, was from a Galician shtetl originally, but I was raised very secularly. My house was Jewish in the ethnic and national sense of being Jewish. It was not Jewish religiously. I mean, we celebrated all the holidays and everything, but the main sense in which my house was Jewish was, my parents speak Hebrew in the house. I didn't learn English until I was in the first grade, or kindergarten. I went to Israel every year because most of our relatives still live in Israel. We're really the only branch of the family that came to the United States, other than the side of my father's family that had come here originally. And so my Jewishness is very much an ethnic, and then moreover, more than that, a national or peoplehood sense of Jewishness. And that's how I think of the state of Israel. I should say my father hates the Orthodox. He remembers when he was during the War of Independence, when the ultra-Orthodox, who were anti-Zionists, were throwing rocks at his caravans. And my father said he wanted to shoot them as much as he wanted to shoot the Arabs. And to this day, my father thinks that they're as big a threat to Israel's well-being as the Arabs are. So anyway, this is how I come to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think you both shared very interesting stories, very striking ones. Um, so why don't we take up this idea? And it's I don't know if either of you read the recent Atlanta cover by Jeffrey Goldberg about should the Jews leave Europe. I mean, David, how would you respond to the argument that there needs to be a Jewish state because of what happened in the 20th century?
Well, I would definitely say there needs to be safety and security for the Jewish people. I mean, I am very much aware that anti-Semitism is still a big problem, and both in the Arab world and in Europe. So I I'm definitely on the side of safety and security for Jews. Now, whether that has to be in the context of a Zionist state is open to question for me. I don't think all the Jews in Europe need to go to Israel. I certainly have always personally felt quite safe as a Jew uh, in Europe, where I lived for a year, in Mexico, where, as I said, I lived for 12 years, and in the United States, where I lived for the rest of my life. So, I understand the Middle East is a very, very, very different situation, but I don't. I really want to separate or try to examine how much of our fear is our paranoia is PTSD from the Holocaust, which I think every at least Ashkenazi Jew experiences, and how much of it is reality based, and keep an open mind about re-examining all that.
Do you mind if I speak to this for a second?
Oh, go for
Yeah.
it.
So actually, I think one of the things that's really important that I'm kind of glad we're doing is to address two things separately. One thing being whether there needs to be some kind of Jewish homeland or entity for the safety or well-being of the Jewish people, and then separately the question of the issue between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because it could be the case that a Jewish national aspiration is rational, but that it can't be made to work in the current situation. I mean, that's a possible state of affairs, and so I like the fact that we've separated these. So let me just speak to very specifically what David just said about whether there needs to be a Jewish state and the question of Jewish safety and security. I would not describe I would not describe this as paranoia. Okay, and let me explain to you why. And I think that I think it's a mistake to describe it as PTSD. Look, the Holocaust is only the most recent version of Christendom's attack on the Jewish people. Christendom's attack on the Jewish people is going to be going on for millennia, thousands of years. Jewish life in Eastern Europe was intolerable in the 19th century, where they were subject to constant pogroms. Right? It was intolerable in Christian Middle Ages, right? To the extent to which most people agree that Jewish life in the Middle Ages was probably better in the Arab lands than it was in
Mm-hmm.
Europe. Okay, and so I want to first of all remind everyone that the Jewish experience of persecution and violence is not just since the Holocaust. The Holocaust is just the latest and worst version of it. It's millennia long. So the idea that because I felt safe for what is relatively 5 minutes, that all of a sudden I say, well, there's no more worry, no more reason to worry, strikes me as misunderstanding history. I will also point out that the Jews felt the most safe when they in fact were the least safe. That is, my mother's family in Hungary was completely assimilated. My mother's father was a high-ranking, wealthy industrialist. They had a summer house. They had a winter house. They had governesses and servants. They were as juiced in as you could possibly be to the upper class, and it made no difference whatsoever. In a proverbial minute, the SS were at their house. The Arrow Cross was at their house, and they were being dragged out by their hair. And so when David says he feels secure, what my answer is, that's very nice. But your feeling of security is about 5 minutes in the duration of the relevant history of Jewish persecution. And I guess I would caution him at not being so secure so fast. A lot of people in the turn of the century felt very secure in Weimar Germany and in other parts of Europe, and they made a terrible mistake feeling so secure.
Dan, I mean, how should I couch this? I mean, so you guys both shared your personal history with Israel, and I'll just briefly say, when I was growing up, I went to Hebrew school, and kind of the value they tried to instill in us was like Israel was our like second homeland after America, and like if we ever needed to go somewhere else, like Israel was the place we would go. And I think I speak for many of the people, at least in my conservative Hebrew school, who were born in the early '80s, saying that this message did not really take. And I feel like that the connection is weakened. But so what a conversation I remember having with some of my friends was saying like, oh, we would definitely go to Canada before Israel. If we had to leave the country, if there was some threat to us as individuals, to us as Jews,
Aryeh,
Canada, England made a lot more sense than Israel.
Aryeh, on that very specific point, that's a great example. My father's father left the Ukraine to go to Germany because Germany was the liberal place to go to. Okay, you have to understand that your judgments are relative, right? Oh yeah, Canada is a great place to go to. Germany was a great place to go to at the turn of the century. That's why so many Russian Jews and Eastern European Jews went there, because the anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe was much worse.
Mm-hmm. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't you think that like the America today is a safer place, the safest place in the world to be Jewish? You don't have
from today's perspective, yes. But I guess what I'm trying to do is to ask you to take a historical point of view. Today is not some unique point in history. Yes, people feel very safe in America today. Jews felt very safe in Germany in 1900. What I'm saying is that shouldn't make you overconfident if you have any appreciation for history at all.
There's also the question of how safe Jews are in Israel.
Well, I agree about that. That's a separate question. That's why I said I'm glad we separated these issues, because we can talk about then this version of trying to have a Jewish state and whether in the end we're better off this way. But I think the first question is my impression is that you're an anti-Zionist, period, which means you don't think that there needs to be a Jewish nation at all, whether it's in Palestine or anywhere else. And that's what I think the first thing we need to discuss is that true?
Well, I really don't want to use the language anti-Zionist, but my sense is that we should be evolving towards a post-Zionism. I would put it that way. And that there are a lot of inherent contradictions within Zionism that bother me. And certainly as it's been practiced in the Palestinian context. If I think abstractly of a Zionist entity, say in Nevada, I think I'd be fine with that because it would be at peace and it would, maybe be like the Mormons in Utah or something. But contextualizing it in Palestine makes all the problems, exacerbates all the contradictions, I think.
Yeah, well, look, I agree that once we start talking about it in the context of the way it wound up being implemented, we have to bring into a whole bunch of other considerations. But in your first round, what you'd said sounded to me like you were saying is that it's sufficient to you that Jews should feel safe in the places that they live, and I guess that they should be guaranteed safety. And I guess part of what I'm saying is that what history should have taught us is that at least up until this point, only we can guarantee our own safety. We cannot leave it to Christendom to guarantee our safety for us, because they didn't. And they didn't for such a long time and to such a great degree that it's really too quick right now to just say, oh, well, we'll trust them again. I don't think 100 years is enough to suddenly trust people, or 50 years is enough to suddenly trust people who you couldn't trust for 2 millennia. Right? So I do think that only we can trust ourselves to be in charge of our own safety.
Well,
Okay,
I
well,
mean, I don't trust the leadership of Israel to be in charge of you know of the Jewish people, and I don't want the state of Israel doing anything in my name, which it quite often does, in the name of the Jewish people and with the supposed tacit assent of the Jewish people. So, I also have a big problem with that aspect of it. I don't want I don't think the IDF represents my interests, and certainly not the Likud party or the
Well,
right wing of Israel.
right, and that brings us.
I'm sure you agree
Yeah,
with
that
that.
brings us to the issue, though, of Israel as it is currently constituted, not the abstract question of whether there should be a Jewish state and whether Jews need to see to their own well-being, and should not remain a nationless people. Then,
Okay, well, I'm for
yeah,
self-determination and a Jewish homeland. I'm with you on that.
okay, okay. Well, then I'm happy to move on and talk about the actual situation in Israel today and with the Palestinians. I mean, I'm happy to move on to that if you want to. Um,
yeah, why don't we? I would just recommend I think I mentioned this in the comments to some previous discussion. There's a Michael Chabon novel called The Yiddish Policeman's
Oh yeah,
Union.
I read that
And
wonderful book.
takes
Yeah,
place in an alternate. It's like a
yeah.
detective novel parody, but it takes place in an alternate reality where Israel fails early on, and Jews instead move to Sitka, Alaska, and that's the Jewish state is this large island off the coast of Alaska. So I mean, there were alternate ideas, uh, you know, mooted in the late 19th century,
I love that
and
book. Yeah, great book.
yeah, it gives an interesting perspective. Yeah, so why don't we move on to the reality and the reality of the Likud victory in the recent elections, which I think was disheartening, probably to the majority of American Jews who align themselves with the Democratic Party. Um, yeah, I mean, you both see, well, I guess Dan, you seemed very disheartened by the Likud victory, and David, you seemed kind of thinking maybe this is kind of the worse the better, kind of this will
Hmm.
heighten the contradictions.
Right.
Would you say that?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
so, David, let me ask you. So, go ahead and maybe you could lay out in what way you think Netanyahu winning will make it more likely that what you hope is going to happen will happen, and maybe that you could use that also as a way of explaining what it is you hope will happen.
Well, I wouldn't say with a great deal of certainty that I think Netanyahu's victory is a good thing, but I think he, particularly the kinds of statements he made towards the end of his campaign, exposed certain strains of Israeli mainstream thinking that is usually considered out of bounds. I mean, I think the American and European selling point of the negotiations in the region was that everybody's on board with the two-state solution. And a lot of Palestinians and a lot of people on the left were very skeptical of that. And, hearing Netanyahu kind of come out of the closet, so to speak, and, say, well, a two-state solution is not really going to happen on my watch, reveals a lot of the futility, I believe, of pursuing the two-state solution. So if I were the two-state solution, I would get a big tattoo across my chest that says DNR, do not resuscitate. I think it is brain dead. I think it's on life support and should not be resuscitated. So I appreciate when those kinds of things are kind of on the table, and we don't pursue what I think is a misguided direction, so that I would like to see everybody kind of admit that we're not going to have a two-state outcome, and then we can move from there to something that, in my view, would be more conducive to peace and justice for everyone involved.
And what is that?
Well, I'm not sure what it is. I'm trying to keep an open mind on that. Um, so I would think that it's not something I will live to see. So I would like to think that future generations will evolve in a direction towards full recognition of Palestinian rights. I would like to see, my vision of the region, which I think is plausible, is that there would be one state of all the citizens, and that there would remain, Hebrew, of course, would remain national language with Arabic, and this would be the center of Jewish culture internationally, just as it is today, and people would be safe, and there could be, there's a lot of room for imagination and room for development of projects within that overall structure that some could guarantee, even if Jews became a minority at some point in the future, that they would have a certain representation in the governance of the country. And, there could be a lot of safeguards. I think this was discussed on a recent Blogging Heads of a kind of constitutional government that could protect all the inhabitants and all the citizens.
We hosted a couple months ago. It was another 3-part conversation. Lisa Goldman and 2 of her colleagues discussing other possibilities to the two-state solution, which we will link to below this video.
Mm-hmm.
You see, I almost feel a little bit like I can see where David's end game is, right? And I might even actually sort of agree with it. What I don't see is the in-between game. That's what I don't see. I don't see the from here to there.
Okay, well that's fair. I mean,
and-
I don't see it either.
Yeah.
But that's what we have. That's what we have to build.
Right, but I guess that maybe what I think is that part of the way there is through something imperfect like a two states. In other words, or even not even a full state, but as something. In other words, there has to be something between here and some kind of cosmopolitan, secularized liberal democracy, where the ethnicities don't matter that much. Look, part of the reason why France can stay France, even if the majority of people are no longer French, is because of the institutions, right? And because the non-French who live there accept those institutions, live under those institutions, and have in a sense absorbed the values inherent in those institutions. And those institutions are largely liberal, they're democratic, they reflect certain modern and Enlightenment attitudes, and so on and so forth. I don't see any way to shortcut those things. In other words, we're seeing the folly of this already in other places in the Middle East, where if you simply throw them democracy in their current state, they vote for jihadists, right? And the problem is that the people you're talking about absorbing, if just given a vote tomorrow, listen, we know who they vote for. They vote for Hamas. And so the problem is that before there are the kinds of institutions, and not just the institutions, but the habits on the part of the people to accept the values reflected in those institutions, just simply shoving them all together and saying, here, go vote for somebody, is not going to work. It's going to be disastrous. You're going to get the same thing that you're getting now all over the place, where they're electing jihadists.
Well, I agree that we can't just do this overnight and say, let's have an election tomorrow and see if the jihadists win, see if Hamas wins. I think, I think, if we got on the same page towards developing this kind of ideal, I will say, I'm not ashamed to use the word idealist, where we do want a secular society, liberal society of all the citizens, where we want to end segregation, where we want to see more interfaith, more interculture, more intermarriage. We have to create those facts on the ground gradually. So, and ways to not do that are to have a big wall, to have all the institutions that within Israel that I believe discriminate against Israeli Arabs who are currently citizens. I mean, we also saw a hint of that in Netanyahu's recent comments about, was it hordes? I don't think it was hordes, but the
Droves.
droves of the Arabs going to the polls. So, I mean, I think this is a day-to-day, person-to-person effort of bridge building with Palestinians. And, I see it going on in a lot of the peace groups. And I think Israel could go a lot farther in fostering this. And I think, the problem I have with a lot of, where Zionism becomes a kind of religion, with Hatikvah and the flag everywhere in synagogues all over the world, the Israeli flag, kids of, really being indoctrinated, I believe, in a very particular militaristic society. The draft in Israel, I mean, I've really always been against conscription in general. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of the institutions of Zionism that kind of have to be more flexible and more open to change and more receptive. And, and Palestinians, of course, are adults and, they have to, have the same kind of, develop the same kind of liberalism that we expect of Israelis. So it's, this is not a, I really like to avoid the kind of language where we blame and shame people into, better behavior. I mean, I think we want to look at it, look into our souls with a little bit of humility and real clear introspection and evolve towards, peace and justice. And it's a difficult road. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm just throwing out a lot of platitudes, but, I do want to, focus on practical ways to do that. But I think, this is my last thing I'll say on this is just that the framework of kind of working towards one state, I think, is more conducive to peace and justice than the separatism that we now see.
I think that, look, I agree with almost everything you just said, to a large degree. I guess what I think though is that what you're describing to be possible, we first of all have to de-radicalize the politics amongst both peoples. And the problem is that the current dynamic is to actually escalate their radicalization. And so, first of all, the constant low-grade warfare guarantees a radicalization of both populations because the extremists in both populations use that low-grade warfare to drive people who might otherwise be more moderate into the arms of the extremists, right? And so Hamas can use the violence to justify getting Palestinians who might otherwise be more inclined to sort of break bread with the Israelis to become more hardened and extreme. And similarly, Netanyahu uses it to drive the center parts of the Israeli electorate to his more extreme position. And I don't see any way so for one thing, I don't see any way to de-radicalize the politics on either side of this without stopping the constant low-grade warfare. The reason why the Israelis built the wall is because the suicide bombings in Jerusalem. And you know something? The minute the damn wall went up, the suicide bombings stopped. I mean, I remember when we were reading about a bus being blown up every week or a pizza parlor being blown up every week. And so in order to de-radicalize both the politics on both sides of this, we have to stop the low-grade warfare. But to do that, we have to have some kind of an agreement. And the agreement right now is not going to be a one-state agreement. It's going to be some kind of separate and cool down agreement. right? And so I guess I think, you know, maybe two-state solution is the wrong word. Maybe it's two entity, half measure, partial sort of solution until everybody can cool down enough for a more civilized people to be elected, right? And then we can have some kind of something moving in the direction you're talking about. But I don't see how this works now. Everything, all the dynamics of the politics, whether it's Hamas, from Hamas all the way over to BDS, all of these people are doing nothing but radicalize both sides of the conflict. And they're ensuring that Netanyahus are going to get elected over and over again. They're assuring that Hamases are going to get elected over and over again. And we could do this forever. The problem is that we could do this forever.
Dan, you just touched on something you mentioned in a comment. Also, you see BDS as, you know, backfiring or at least moving the Israeli population to the right. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Well, look, I'll tell you that whenever you directly challenge someone's legitimacy, which is what BDS does, you in a sense drive them into a defensive posture. And I will tell you, my entire family that lives in Israel are leftists, but I can hear the way their backs get up when they hear this sort of stuff being voiced by the BDS crowd, and that is, you know, excuse me, you know, we're sitting here trying to you know, go to work and go to school and take care of our elderly and stuff like that, and every day and a siren goes off and I got to push my grandfather in a wheelchair into a shelter, and now you're telling me that you're gonna boycott us, and you're gonna and you think that that our whole country is racist and we're like South Africa, and all these sorts of hyperbole and in my opinion outrageous sort of characterizations, given that Israel is the only remotely liberal country in the entire region, I think is completely counterproductive. I mean, if, you know, David just said we need to stop demonizing, but that's all that people like BDS do, is demonize Israel. The rhetoric is completely counterproductive. If what you're trying to do is really de-radicalize the parties, BDS is the best thing that ever happened to Netanyahu. The best thing, other than Hamas, BDS is the best thing that ever happened to Netanyahu.
David, would you have a response to that or a defense of the BDS movement?
Well, yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that the BDS movement is a nonviolent movement. And, you know, I don't like to hear it compared to Hamas, which is a movement based on violence. And
I'm not comparing it to Hamas.
No. Okay. But, you know, I would also say that, okay, I hear you, and I hear your objections to BDS. I don't share them, but I would like to, you know, engage in dialogue with, you know, I mean, it's interesting to me how your relatives respond to that. You know, I mean, I hear you saying, you know, when my relatives hear this, they feel attacked, they feel panicky, they feel fearful, they feel misunderstood. You know, so I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think we need to explore, how people's feelings affect, you know, their political response. So, you know, you can also look to the BDS people and say, well, how does it make you feel when, you know, Palestinian aspirations are, you know, or you see a Palestinian child killed in Gaza? You know, well, you know, it depresses me, it horrifies me, it makes me feel deeply aggrieved, it makes me feel there's no excuse for this kind of behavior. I feel afraid. You know, so, I mean, people can talk about those things, and a dialogue can move forward. So, you know, I would say keep those channels of communication open. You know, once they get, you're right, once they get fossilized into, or calcified into these rigid political positions, then it's almost too late. I mean, that's how I feel as a, you know, it's kind of my philosophy as a pacifist, that people will always say, you know, well, what do you do when Hitler comes along? Or what do you do when, you know, any tyrant comes along, aren't you going to act in self-defense? I like to say that I think that when that happens, it's too late already. That we all bear some responsibility in a certain set of circumstances, where it becomes just utterly kind of demonic chaos, and there are no good answers. So I like to say now is the time to pursue peaceful resolution, to pursue dialogue, pursue a conversation that includes everyone, and be respectful of everyone's feelings. So I do want to be very respectful of your relatives' feelings. I can only imagine what it's like to be fired upon in Sderot or wherever it is, whatever town in Israel might be attacked. But on the other side, I can certainly imagine what it's like to feel the wrath of the IDF come raining down on you with bombing that is going to set. I mean, I don't want to get into the details.
No, I agree with you about that. If I was prime minister, I'd unilaterally withdraw from all the territories right now. I mean, that's not the issue. The issue is how do we get. I actually agree with your end game, even. Because I'm a secular Zionist. I don't think Israel should be a Jewish state in the sense of religiously. So I actually agree with you that Israel, at the end of the day, should be a liberal democracy in the Middle East with a pluralistic population. I completely agree with that as an end game. The question is, how do we get there? And I think you agree with me that we will not get there until there is a real peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I think we also agree that we won't get there until each side's politics have been de-radicalized. And I guess what I'm not seeing is, what is your proposal for how to de-radicalize both Israeli politics and Palestinian politics so that they can make a productive peace with each other?
Well, I'm not sure I would look at it in terms of a productive peace with each other. I mean, the model I'm kind of looking at is, just include each other, and we will figure out how the peace happens. I'm not sure that I really trust either side to negotiate, kind of peace settlement. I think we really need to work together.
How?
Well,
right now we have two governments. We've got Netanyahu and we've got Hamas. How are they going to work together?
Well,
we need to get rid of them before we can work together. No?
Well, maybe so.
So how are we going to get rid of them?
Well, I mean, to get rid of Netanyahu by voting him out of office.
Right, but how are you going to do that when the electorate is radicalized?
Okay, well, yeah. Oh, so I see what you mean by de-radicalizing the electorate. Well, yeah. I'm saying, okay, so there are a lot of things. I would say, education needs to change. We need more cultural interchange. We need people like you talking on blogging heads to Palestinians. I really appreciated when Bob went to the West Bank and came back and had a couple of programs with Palestinians, activists. Those are the kinds of things that bridge the gap and make conversation possible. There's this really great, I don't know if you've seen it, Avodah Aravit, Arab Labor. It's a Israeli comedy that's been playing on PBS.
Yeah.
It's really good, and it has characters who are, they're often stereotypical, but it's also a very human kind of warm comedy. And there's a Palestinian woman whose parents live in Gaza. She's married to a Jewish boy who's in the IDF, who has parents who have big prejudices against Arabs. It's just wonderful, and it was popular in Israel, primetime Israeli TV. So, we just have to kind of open our hearts and minds, I think, and, figure out ways to avoid the violence and raise, there are a lot of programs like Seeds of Peace, which is a program that brings together teenagers who are, Palestinian teenagers with Israeli teenagers, and they kind of, they spend a summer together or several weeks. They bond. They go back to their different cultures, but they go back to their cultures with a different mindset and a different kind of emotional attachment to each other that I think will last a lifetime. I've seen kids like that, and Yeah, go ahead.
Look, I agree. I agree with you. I can now. I kind of see where this where we're. It's not even that we so much disagree. Look, I can see how a kind of a bottom up, a ground up cultural transformation can occur in the sort of informal ways that you're describing. Right. The problem is it's very slow and it's multi generational. In a sense, you kind of have to wait for several generations to die. Right. Um, and the problem is that the cost over the in the meantime is enormous. And so while I completely support those kinds of efforts and mutual arts effort, there's all sorts of stuff going on in the artistic community. I also think that maybe an untapped source of ways of crossing bridges is through scientific communities. I know in the Cold War, that was one of the only, there were points where those were the only Russians and Americans that were talking to each other were scientists. But that kind of bottom up percolating cultural transformation, I think also has to, at the same time, there have to be some things done from the top. In other words, we can't keep having this kind of constant warfare and keep electing governments like Netanyahu and people like Hamas to run things, and that's going to require some hard political decisions. It's going to require people to let a lot of things go. It's going to require some people to take some deals that look bad at the front. But if we just wait for the culture to turn decent, it's going to take 50 years. It's going to take 100 years, and in the meantime, you're going to have a pile of bodies that none of us wants. And so I don't think that that's all you have to. I think that's not all you can do. You need to do more than that. Look, I'll give you an analogy that's not so much life and death, but it's similar. We could have simply waited until Americans accepted gay people. If you'd waited 2 generations, you wouldn't have even had to have a single court case. You could have simply, we could have simply done it through popular vote. The problem was it's a bit much to ask 2-3 generations of gay people to give up their lives while they wait for the culture to catch up. And so that's why we pursued both a bottom-up strategy and a strategy through the courts, which is a top-down strategy. And I think similarly in the Middle East, while I fully support the kinds of things you're talking about from a way of a bottom-up strategy, there has to be something done at the level of the politics we have now, or else the death toll is going to continue to go on, and it may be decades, if not 100 years, before we finally get to the point that you're hoping we get to.
Well, Dan, with the reality of the Netanyahu victory, I mean, do you see any progress? I mean, there has been seemingly some kind of shift. Maybe it's temporary, maybe it's permanent, between Obama and how he's treating the Israel issue. Do you think that might have an effect, or do you think we need to wait for a different political leadership in Israel?
I think we need to. I actually think that right now the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama is so poisoned that I just don't see that. I think it's actually we need to wait till the next American election more than the next Israeli one. Look, Netanyahu is a shit and a bastard. I mean, this is not even controversial. The day he won, I got so many emails from my relatives that were literally weeping in their email about this man being elected again because of the harm he's done. But at this point, his relationship with Obama is so toxic. And now this thing most recently where Obama and this ridiculous thing he did of opening all these records about the Israeli nuclear program in some kind of infantile revenge gesture against Netanyahu's equally infantile performance in the Congress. I really think that at this point we need to have, it's going to be the next president that deals with Netanyahu. And I hope he deals with him very firmly. But I'll tell you something else we need to do. The Palestinians listen to the other Arab states, at least some of them. And I really think that we not only need to lean on Israel very heavily, we need to lean on the people that the Palestinians listen to very, very heavily and say, get those damn people to the table. I want this low-grade warfare stopped now. And I think that has to stop. I think if you had just even a few years with no violence between the two, the politics would de-radicalize, and you could actually elect decent people to some of these offices. But right now, it's going to take the Arab mentors and patrons leaning very hard on the Palestinian leadership, as well as the American leaning very hard on the Israeli leadership. And I think Obama does. I don't think Obama's got it. I think it's going to have to be the next person.
Mm-hmm. David, do you see anything? I mean, do you think Netanyahu's victory is possibly going to change how, change the situation politically on the international stage?
Well, probably short answer, no. I think, there have to be much more fundamental kind of radical changes. I think, it may be interesting to see how the presidential elections in the United States, how they stake out positions. And I'm sure it's kind of interesting, the dynamic we have now with the Democratic Party. A lot of the, is very closely affiliated with a lot of very, very, very staunchly pro-Israel funders and forces and organizations like AIPAC and even J Street, the liberal one. But at the same time, I think we're finding younger voters. I think I mentioned this in a post on Blogging Heads. Latinos, African Americans, and youth in general who are less affiliated with Israel and tend to vote Democratic. So there are both constituencies within the Democratic Party. So it might be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of pushing the United States a little bit towards the center of world opinion and not seen as kind of Israel's sponsor on the Security Council and in the United Nations unconditionally. So I think that would be a good thing, in my view, to have the United States be seen as a bit more objective and less kind of, all the military aid that goes to Israel, all the, the Congress inviting, the Republican Congress, admittingly inviting John Boehner, inviting Netanyahu to speak, a special session of Congress, blah, blah, blah. So, I think Dan's right to suggest that, I'm more interested in kind of the long game and, building slowly. I don't think, there periodically different stages of this emergency emerge. It's definitely unsustainable where we're at now. I don't see, it's dysfunctional. It's not improving. So yeah, we need to work on all aspects of it. And if Israel can move more towards the center, that's great too. If the United States can be a little bit less staunchly pro-Israel, that's great. But I think it's a long struggle, and that will go on to future generations. On the other hand, I'll just say very quickly that I think in terms of gay and lesbian rights, for example, and transgender rights, we did move very quickly. And, suddenly the whole landscape changes. I think the landscape is changing very quickly in terms of, the acceptance of marijuana. The Soviet Union, communism, when I grew up, it looked like they were going to be around for 500 years. And things changed very quickly and non-violently. The Soviet collapse was pretty much completely non-violent. So I think, history surprises us sometimes. And if we have a little faith in the process and really work hard at it, maybe we can achieve our goals. And I'm glad to see that there is a lot that Dan and I agree on. And, I'm happy to see that, we can tone down the rhetoric and respect each other and move forward.
I think part of it, actually, just purely as a technical matter, David, I think the internet is the worst possible, in terms of typing comments, the worst possible way to have these kinds of exchanges. I think it increases contentiousness. It brings out the worst elements of these conversations. I would say I want to say very, very quickly about the gay lesbian thing, though. I agree with you that it happened very quickly. But would you agree with me that it happened as a result not just of a bottom-up effort, but of a top-down effort? In other words, a lot of states, including the one I'm living in, passed anti-gay marriage amendments, it's because they were struck down by courts that we have gay marriage in a lot of these places, not because there was a groundswell of change of public opinion. If we'd simply waited for that to happen, it would have taken a lot longer.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we definitely need to have faith in the courts and in the legal system. So that, I mean, that's another reason why I don't want to see us get locked in too much to that kind of two-state framework when we may be able to come up with something better.
Okay.
That's an optimistic note, so maybe we should end there.
Sure. I think this was well aired. I think it's very clear.
Okay, well, the discussion will continue in the comments, I'm sure. Thank you, David. Thank you, Dan, for participating in this debate/discussion. I hope our viewers enjoyed it, and tune in next time.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to talk to you, David.
Great to talk to you too, Dan.
All right.